Was Persephone kidnapped, or did she choose darkness? The myth of Hades and Persephone is often told as a simple abduction story. But what if it's actually about transformation, autonomy, and the psychology of becoming? Today we're diving deep into mythology's most misunderstood relationships and what it reveals about power, choice, and the shadow self. By the end, you might see Persephone not as a victim, but as an architect of her own underworld throne. The psychology of the gods. The psychology of the underworld's queen. The traditional story. Let's start with what everybody knows. Persephone, daughter of Demeter, goddess of the harvest, is picking flowers in a meadow when the earth splits open. Hades, the god of the underworld, emerges and drags her down below. Demeter grieves so deeply that the earth becomes barren, an eternal winter. Zeus intervenes. A deal is struck. Persephone can return to the surface, but she's eaten 6 pomegranate seeds in the underworld. Those that consume food in Hades' realm are bound to it forever, so she must spend part of each year below and part above. When she descends, winter comes. When she rises, spring returns. But here's where it gets interesting. In most retellings of the story, Persephone is passive, a victim swept into trauma, but ancient sources tell a much more complex story. In the Homeric hymn to Demeter, Persephone's voice is almost absent, but in later traditions, she becomes the Dread Queen, feared even by Hades himself. What if Persephone didn't just survive the underworld? What if she became it? In Jungian psychology, Persephone begins as a maiden archetype, innocence, youth, and potential. She exists entirely in her mother's world, picking flowers, tending to animals, and untouched by darkness or complexity. But the maiden has a shadow, stagnation. Without descent, without struggle, there's no individualization, no becoming a full self. The abduction represents a psychological rupture, the moment where life forces us into the unknown. It's traumatic, yes, but it's also the only way growth happens. From a DSM-5 perspective, Persephone's initial response to the abduction would likely meet the criteria for adjustment disorder with mixed anxiety and depressed mood, significant impairment in social and occupational functioning, stress-related disturbance not meeting the criteria for another mental disorder, symptoms developed within 3 months of the stressor. Her acute response, the sudden removal from the known environment and loss of autonomy, could also present with acute stress disorder, which features intrusive symptoms, unwanted memories of the surface world, negative mood, despair, inability to experience positive emotions, dissociative symptoms, feeling detached from surroundings, avoidance symptoms, avoiding reminders of her former life, arousal symptoms, hypervigilance in unfamiliar underworld environment. Hades isn't just a villain, he's a symbol. In Jungian terms, he represents the shadow, the rejected, hidden, underground parts of ourselves. He's associated with death, wealth, the riches of the earth, and the unconscious. He's not evil, he's necessary. Without Hades, there's no depth, no transformation, no underworld to retrieve lost parts of the self. Hades doesn't steal Persephone, he initiates her. Carl Jung called the process of becoming whole individualization, integrating the conscious and the unconscious, light and shadow. Persephone's descent mirrors this. She leaves the surface world, consciousness, the known, enters the underworld, unconscious, the hidden, and eventually returns, but changed, carrying knowledge from both realms. This is the hero's journey, but from a feminine perspective. Not conquest, but integration. The pomegranate seeds are the pivot point of the myth. Did Hades trick her? Did she eat them knowingly? The ancient texts are deliberately ambiguous, but there's a psychological key. Eating is an act of consent. To consume something is to internalize it, to make it part of yourself. Persephone doesn't just visit the underworld, she consumes it. She makes it hers. Let's look at this from a different angle. What if Persephone ate the seeds on purpose? What if after being forced into the underworld, she realized something? That the surface world was suffocating, defined entirely by her mother's needs and expectation? That in darkness she found power, autonomy, and a throne of her own? That she could both be Kore, the maiden, and Persephone, the dread queen. The pomegranate wasn't a trap, it was a choice. To stop being defined by others. From a developmental psychology perspective, Persephone's transformation aligns with identity achievement. Moving from identity foreclosure, living in mother's expectations, to achieved identity, self-determined values and goals. This mirrors the post-traumatic growth, the phenomenon where people don't just survive trauma, but they are transformed by it. Research by Tedeschi and Calhoun identifies 5 domains of growth: greater appreciation of life and changed priorities, warmer, more intimate relationships with others, greater sense of personal strength. If I survive this, I can handle anything. Recognition of new possibilities or paths for one's life. Spiritual development. Persephone's story captures this paradox. The descent that breaks you can also make you whole. It is crucial to separate Persephone's transformation from Stockholm Syndrome, that is where hostages develop positive feelings towards captors as a survival mechanism. Stockholm Syndrome is characterized by positive feelings towards the captor, negative feelings towards authorities trying to help, support of the captor's reasons and behaviors, positive feelings reciprocated by the captor. Persephone's narrative differs because she does not imply a bond with her capture. She claims autonomous power. She transformed the power dynamic, becoming co-ruler, not a subordinate. Her choice involves self-discovery, not mere survival attachment. The ancient texts describe her as becoming more powerful than Hades in certain domains. Let's talk about Demeter, because this myth isn't just about Persephone. Demeter embodies the Great Mother archetype, nourishing, protective, life-giving. But when distorted, the Great Mother becomes the devouring mother, possessive, controlling, unable to let go. Demeter's grief is real, but it's also a refusal to accept her daughter's autonomy. She plunges the world into famine, not just mourning, but punishing everyone for her loss. She demands Persephone return completely, no compromise, no recognition that her daughter might have changed. Demeter's relationship with Persephone shows features consistent with dependent personality disorder traits. Though as a goddess, she doesn't fully meet the diagnostic criteria. difficulty making everyday decisions without excessive advanced reassurance, needs for others to assume responsibility for major life areas, difficulty expressing disagreement due to fear of loss of support, urgently seeking another's relationship as a source of care when the relationship ends, unrealistically preoccupation with fears of being left to care for oneself. More accurately, this represents enmeshment, when a parent's identity is so fused with their child's that separation feels like death. This creates blurred boundaries between parent and child. Child's needs need to sublimate to the parent's emotional needs. Difficulty with age-appropriate separation and individualization. Parent experiencing child's independence as betrayal or abandonment. Demeter cannot imagine Persephone as separate from herself. The underworld isn't just dangerous, it's unthinkable because it exists outside of her control. Demeter's love is real, but love without boundaries becomes a prison. For Persephone to individuate, she must separate from Demeter. The abduction, traumatic as it is, forces what Demeter would never allow: distance. And that distance creates the possibility of a new relationship where Persephone isn't just Demeter's daughter, but her own sovereign being. Let's be clear. Abduction is wrong. Full stop. No romanticizing about it. No wish-washy, no. Maybe, no. But mythologically, Hades is one of the most complex gods. Unlike Zeus, he's faithful to Persephone, mostly. He doesn't leave the underworld to meddle in mortal affairs. He's the god of hidden wealth, both literal in minerals and gems, and psychologically with shadow work and depth. In Jungian psychology, the animus is the masculine aspect within the feminine psyche, representing rationality, assertion, and connection to the unconscious. Hades functions as Persephone's animus. He draws her into the depths she wouldn't have explored alone. He challenges the one-dimensional identity imposed by her mother. He represents the power she didn't know she had. Hades isn't the enemy. He's the mirror, showing Persephone the parts of herself she was never allowed to see. It's very important to distinguish between trauma as pathology, requiring clinical intervention. These would be persistent and re-experiencing, avoidance behaviors that impair functioning, negative alterations in cognition and mood, marked alterations in arousal and reactivity. These could all be part of PTSD. Trauma as a catalyst for growth. Crisis that disrupts existing identity and worldview. Opportunity for re-advisement of values and priorities. Development of new coping strategies and resilience. Integration of experience into expanded self-concept. Persephone's narrative suggests the latter, not minimizing the trauma, but recognizing that some individuals emerge from adversity with expanded psychological capabilities. In the patriarchal readings, Hades rescues Persephone from her mother. But if we dig a little bit deeper in the readings, Persephone uses Hades to access her own underworld, her shadow, her power, her autonomy. By the end, she doesn't belong to him. She rules beside him, and in many texts, she becomes more feared than he is. The final arrangement, Persephone splitting her time between worlds, isn't a compromise, it's integration. She embodies both, Kori, spring, maiden, light, and Persephone, winter, queen, darkness. Daughter and sovereign, surface and depth. This is a psychological goal, not to choose between parts of yourself, but to honor all of them. This reflects dialectic behavioral therapy's core principle: synthesis of opposites. Rather than either-or thinking, Persephone achieves both and. Both traumatizing and empowered. Both daughter and queen. Both light and shadow. This represents psychological integration, the hallmark of mature identity formation. This is different than splitting, a BPD defense mechanism, seeing self, others as all good or all bad. Compartmentalization, keeping contradictory beliefs separate. Integration, synthesizing contradictions into a coherent whole. Persephone's story offers a blueprint for transformation. Descent is inevitable. Life will pull you into darkness whether you choose it or not. Agency exists even in trauma. You can't control what happens, but you can decide what it means. Integration requires both worlds. Denying your shadow doesn't make you whole. Embracing it does. Separation from parent is necessary. You can't become yourself when living in someone else's story. Persephone teaches us that you can honor where you came from without being defined by it. That you can hold both the flower and the throne. That descent doesn't destroy you, it reveals you. If Persephone's story resonates because you experience persistent intrusive thoughts about traumatic events, avoidance behaviors that limit your life, difficulty regulating emotions, relationship patterns that repeat harmful dynamics, identity confusion that causes great distress, consider consulting a mental health professional. I've included links to services in the description below. Transformation is powerful, but sometimes we need guides for the underworld journey. Before Zeus, Hera, and the Olympian patriarchy, Persephone was worshipped independently. A powerful goddess in her own right, associated with sovereignty, women's mysteries, and cycles of life and death. The myth didn't elevate her, it contained her. By making her story about men's choices, Hades' abductions, Zeus's deal, rather than her own agency. What makes Persephone's story endure isn't the abduction, it's the transformation. She shows us that the parts of you that descend into darkness don't die, they're reborn. Power doesn't come from avoiding the underworld, it comes from ruling it. You don't have to choose between who you were and who you are becoming. Persephone's journey reminds us the maiden doesn't disappear when the queen emerges. They're the same person, finally whole. Persephone is the goddess we call abducted, when we should call her transformed. The maiden we call passive, when we should call her evolving. The queen we call trapped, when we should call her sovereign. Her story isn't about marriage. It's about what happens when you stop living someone else's expectations and start inhabiting the full range of who you are. Persephone never goes on to tell her story in her own words, but you can tell yours. If Persephone is the goddess of transformation through descent, who's the goddess of rage through betrayal? Check out my previous video on Hera's revenge and the psychology of betrayal. If this analysis helped you see Persephone or yourself in a new light, subscribe for more deep dives into mythology and the mind. Comment below, do you see Persephone as a victim or a queen? What myths should we explore next? And remember, sometimes darkness isn't the enemy. Sometimes it's where you finally find yourself.